Welcome to Key Essentials, Investment Rules, Sustainable Development and the Law. We're here today in this supervision to talk about some of the basic concepts linking investment law with sustainable development. We're very fortunate that a new book has just come out on investment law and sustainable development, and it's being assigned for this short course. We're in the beautiful gardens of Robinson College, and we're conducting a small model supervision. So we have been joined by some students and colleagues who are experts in this area and who are interested in learning about these questions. I understand from our learners that you have a few questions for Professor Gehring and myself. Please.
Yeah, I have a very fundamental question. That is, what is sustainable development? And what are the UN Sustainable Development Goals and why they are very important for investments?
Well, actually, that's a very good question for this course, especially. And in investment law and sustainable development, and also in 30 years of dialogue in the United Nations, the idea of sustainable development has almost worked as a bridge between those who are especially concerned about improving the quality of life of the people in their country and those who are concerned about violating the environmental limits about which we live and that we depend on for our livelihoods and for all other species on Earth. The concept of sustainable development then offers a way through. It's the idea that yes, development is needed, but it needs to be development that is sensitive, not just to environmental constraints, but also to human rights and a real focus on ending poverty. Now, after 30 years of dialogue, countries came together to agree 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Under those goals are 169 targets, laying out an agenda, a common agenda that is relevant for countries, whether they are rich or poor, developed or developing, that would actually lead to a much more sustainable future, development that can last. And in the SDGs in particular, there are quite a few that without investment would be impossible. Actually, some of the studies that have been done have showed that we are missing in financing for sustainable development trillions of pounds or dollars, if you prefer, that if we are able to encourage public and private investment in the direction of the sustainable development goals, we're actually able to much better solve those problems. So according to the UN, investment is actually key to achieving sustainable development. If you look at the substance of the goals themselves, they include, for example, goal 1, no poverty. Ending poverty without investment would be difficult. Another goal, goal 2, zero hunger. Again, investment in sustainable, climate smart food systems that will be able to support the livelihoods of the people that depend on them and also be able to provide food without waste worldwide requires a great deal of investment. Some of the complex goals, such as Goal 13, bold action on climate change, or Goal 14 and 15, protecting life on land and life below water, these ones also require investment. And perhaps among the most important, as one of my colleagues who has written a chapter in this book explain, if we can't invest in access to clean energy, access to clean water and sanitation, education and health, we may be facing very difficult problems in achieving those sustainable development goals. So the short answer is there's a giant financing gap for achieving sustainable development, and investment is one of the ways of helping to close that gap.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I understand you have other questions for me and for Professor Gehring.
Yeah, thank you so much. How are these international investments connected to sustainable development issues like climate change and inequality?
Excellent. I think one of the points that is possibly the most important is that in order to achieve bold, fast, desperately necessary action to address the existential threat of climate change, we do need not just to ensure that we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions as we agreed in the Paris Agreement, but also that we support adaptation and resilience, and also that we channel, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement promises, investment and finance worldwide into a sustainable economy, a low greenhouse gas emissions development pathway. And so on climate change, with investment, it's possible to pay for carbon removal. It's possible to pay for climate smart agriculture. It's possible to pay for renewable rather than obsolete fossil fuel technologies. With investment, it's possible to invest in flood defenses and other adaptation measures, and to invest in resilient communities and infrastructure. Also, with investment, of course, the redirecting of the global financial architecture is more realistic. In terms of inequality, same challenge exists. Some types of investment might exacerbate inequality, making the rich richer and the poor poorer, to put it clearly. Other types of investment can help to even inequality, can help to ensure that, for example, 50% of the world's population, women and girls, have access to education, have access to good jobs, have access to opportunities to develop their human potential. This kind of opening up human capability and human potential is one of the main definitions of development that is sustainable, that has been especially proposed by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, a professor here in Cambridge as well. And so what is very important to understand is that investment is an enabler of equality or inequality. Investment is a facilitator, perhaps even plays a role in scaling up either action in the wrong direction on climate change. If we're investing in technologies that generate greenhouse gas emissions, or in the opposite, the adoption and financing of clean energy transition technologies, just clean energy transition technologies that are so important for addressing climate change. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. I think we have another question as well for Professor Gehring.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to know who are the key players in sustainable investment governance?
Thank you so much for that question. And it's particularly important when we're discussing investment law, right? So traditionally, the main focus was on the home state of the investor, the host state of the investment, and the investor itself. But if we take sustainable development as a concept and an objective, and the sustainable development goals seriously, we need to look at a much wider group of stakeholders that are either affected by the investment or need to get involved in investment decision making. So it's the local community that hosts the investments. It's indigenous peoples on whose land the investment takes place. It is the broader non-governmental NGO community in both the host state of the investment, so where the investment takes place, but also in the home state, the state that is offered enhanced investment protections. If we cast our net even wider, we can also identify other economic actors such as banks, international banks, even the World Bank has a role to play when it comes to investment law. So I think when we're talking about sustainable development and investment law, we should not focus just on the company that is making an investment in another country. We need to look at all and research all stakeholders that are affected by the investment decision.
Now, I'm going to ask one more question because we're joined here today, and we will be speaking to him more in some of the other modules of this course, by Dr. Kennedy Mbeva, who is actually a leading expert in this area as well and has looked at some of the African treaties especially. And I wonder if Professor Marcus, Dr. Mbeva, would you be able to tell us, what do you think the role of international law is in guiding sustainable development, in especially sustainable investment? And I'm asking in a sort of a broad way, because in this introductory module 1, I think it's very important to focus on what treaties and principles and even private contracts might be doing to shape investment toward sustainability.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important question, because when we think about investment, we think about the investor in more importantly, the foreign investor. And we also think about the profits. And when we think about investment agreements, we think about them as a kind of treaties or agreements that would protect the foreign investor and their profits. But then there's a discussion because, Gideon, the very big problems that we have about sustainability, be it climate change, inequality, poverty, etc. There's a big debate on whether investment agreements should play a bigger role than just protecting the interests or the profits of foreign investors. And there are opportunities as well to advance that agenda. In the African context, for example, there is the African Investment Protocol, which is being developed. And the idea is to try and develop a kind of agreement that is modern, and modern in the sense that it goes beyond protecting the interests of the foreign investor to try and address some of the social goals, such as climate change, such as issues of equality, and other aspects of sustainability. So we see there's this kind of move towards thinking in a broader sense about the role of investment agreements, not just protecting profits or the interests of the foreign investors, but also meeting other social goals.
Which comes back to the question about inequality, I think, and which is very, very important. Professor Gehring, is there anything you could add about the role of international law? What kind of international legal instruments in this introductory module should we be thinking about already?
Absolutely. So traditionally, the focus was very narrow on what we would call bilateral investment treaties, right? So specific treaty instruments, often very short, that would just protect the investments of an investor in another country. More and more, investment law has become much more diverse. We have international investment agreements as part of international trade agreements, as part of regional trade treaties, such as the Common African Free Trade Agreement. But also, more and more investors and countries are resorting to international contracts. So rather than having an international treaty, they are determining their relationship in a contractual way. And of course, if you make a contract with a state, international law is involved in governing at least part of that particular agreement. So none of investment law lives in clinical isolation. That means other international agreements, such as the Paris Agreement on climate change, also contain certain investment obligations, right? So the third pillar of the Paris Agreement is on climate finance. Well, how does climate finance come about? Well, we need investment for climate finance. And so we can also start looking in other international treaties, Convention on Biological Diversity, the Paris Agreement on climate change, to identify investment provisions.